This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Yael Berda.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. All you have to do is go to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that we like to call Israel Behind the Headlines, delving deep into and unpacking issues underlying our lives here in Israel.
Our guest today is a historian at the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, specializing in the histories of Jews and Arabs in Israel and Palestine. His most recent book is meant for a lay audience, Enemies, a Love Story, Mizrahi Jews, Palestinian Arabs, and Ashkenazi Jews from the rise of Zionism to the present, takes a bird's-eye view on more than a century of complex sectarian relations, sometimes conflicting, sometimes complementary, in this piece of land that we call home. It was published earlier this year in Hebrew and forthcoming soon in English with Pennsylvania State University Press. Professor Hillel Cohen, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
So as you write, over the many decades that you review in your book, the conception of Mizrahiness, and even the terminology, whether Mizrahi, Sephardi, etc., evolved greatly. So in what way does your long-view approach to the Mizrahi issue enrich our understanding of the tenets of Mizrahiness, the very definition of what Mizrahi is?
Well, I think that basically the very fact that Mizrahi identity is still strong in Israel in 2021, 2022, is very important in the sense that the leaders of Zionism, the first leaders of the State of Israel, people like Ben Gurion and others, they believed that the second or maybe the third generation of Mizrahim would be melted into what they call the Israeli society. What happened is that the Mizrahim became the Israeli society, and the Ashkenazim are not very well integrated now into what became the Israeli society.
And it was not the way history foresaw it, right? Or it's also counterintuitive to the way that people think of Israeli history, right? Of the predominant component of it being the Ashkenazi and the Mizrahi is a secondary one. And basically you're suggesting that in at least in a sociological way, it's different.
True. And this is mainly because the leadership of Zionism or the very Zionist movement was based on Ashkenazi Jews. But the demography speaks much more than, speeches in the Zionist Congress in Basel. And when we look at the demography of the State of Israel, it's very different from the demography of the Jewish people. The Jewish people, let's say, when the Zionist movement started its activity in Palestine, Ashkenazi Jews were 90% of war Jewry, and Mizrahi Jews were 10%. But in Israel, soon after its establishment, the Mizrahi Jews became 50% or so of the population. And they became, of course, more and more, I wouldn't say dominant, but exist in public affairs, in everywhere. I mean, they are the Israeli society. I say they are, sorry, but maybe we can say we are.
Right. So some of us are,
or
partially,
not me, at least.
Partially are. Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah.
There's this thing about we, and I wanna jump back to the historical for a moment. Because you tell a very distinct story about the divergent roles of the Ottoman and British rule in the making of local identities. Can you tell us more about that transition to the British Mandate and how it solidifies religious and ethnic identities, basically international ones?
Well, first of all, during the Ottoman period, the Jews of Mizrahi origin, and the word Mizrahi was not in use at that time. So we can say Jews of Sephardi origin or from Muslim countries and so on. They were the majority, and they also were, part of them were part of the elite of the Jewish Yishuv, which was also not called the Jewish Yishuv during the Ottoman period. But they were the majority in Jerusalem until the rise of, or the aliyot of the Ashkenazim. And they were also the majority in towns like Tiberias or Haifa or Jaffa and so on and so forth. They also were well connected to the Muslim elite or to the Ottoman leadership. So they were the people in charge of the Jewish community. All this changed after the Second Aliyah, and more so during First World War. Because during the war, because of the Zionist movement was already in existence, and they were much more organized than the Sephardic communities here. And their channels to assist the Jewish Yishuv in Palestine was the Zionist committees and not the local committees of the Sephardim. And this was the first step which made the Zionist movement the more dominant power among the Jews in Palestine and Eretz Israel. And after the war, it was more so, because Balfour Declaration was given to the Zionist movement. There is an old version that I found in the British archive
Of the Balfour Declaration.
Of the declaration, in which the declaration was addressed to the Jews of Palestine and not to the Zionist movement. And during the war, and this is partly, of course, because of the endeavor of Chaim Weizmann, the declaration was given to the Zionist World Organization, and then they became the official leadership of the Jewish community in Palestine.
But this little anecdote really unveils a very fundamental issue here, and that is really the very different agendas of the Zionist movement and the predominantly Mizrahi Jews of Palestine at the time. Whether Zionist or not is a separate question that perhaps you will address in a second. But really, the newcomers from Europe, however organized they were, came with an agenda to for a sort of an overall of the Jewish existence in Palestine, and the predominantly Mizrahi Jews were more inclined to certain sort of continuity.
Definitely, I would say, but this might seem or sound very strange. The Jews of Palestine, their political aim was to achieve equality with the Arabs, Muslims, and Christians of Palestine. The Jews who came from Europe via the Zionist movement, they came to establish a Jewish homeland or a Jewish state, meaning to dominate the Arabs. So this was the main difference. And because they were dominant of many Mizrahim in a process that one of its peak moments was the massacres of 1929 in Hebron and Tzfat and Jerusalem, they understood that they better side with the Zionist movement and not with the Arabs.
So this is where it comes from. You look at also within the Mizrahi community themselves, two very opposing trajectories of adherence to Zionism or to that matrix of identities in Israel, in Palestine. On the one hand, you write that some of the Mizrahim sought to exploit their acquaintance with the Arabic language and culture in order to facilitate the Ashkenazi dominant Zionism to the Arab world, on the one hand, so sort of like a Zionist agents without the nefarious aspects of that phrase, and the others sought to exploit that very same acquaintance in order to team up, sort of, in inverted commas, with the Palestinians in opposition to the Ashkenazi dominant Zionism. So without asking you which is more authentically Mizrahi, because probably there's no answer to that, how do you account for such very different outlooks within the same community?
I would say that the majority, of course, were passive, neither to the side of the Arabs nor in the side of the Zionists, because this is human nature. So in every such situation, let's look at the silent majority. Now, when we are talking about people who are more active in the public sphere, some of them were really well connected with the local Palestinians. They were part of the local fabric and they felt very well with it. Now, at the same time, they had some ideas about Jewish, even Messianism. They know what is written in the Bible. They are part of the Jewish tradition of building the temple and so on and so forth. But this had nothing to do with real politics. The politics of here and now was, we are partner, we live together, we can share the homeland. Now, what does it mean exactly to share the homeland? This changes over time or changed over time. During the Ottoman period, it meant that we can be two communities or three communities, however you count them, that live under the Ottoman rule. We are brothers under, this is the name of the book of Michel Campos. We are brothers in this homeland. Now, after the rise of the Zionist movement and after the Balfour Declaration, which gave privilege to the Zionist movement, the decision is much more delicate because here you have an opportunity to be dominant for the Jews. Now, the Jews also they have a kind of memory of being under Muslim rule, which was, okay, not cruel as a Christian and so on, but still, it felt sometimes, in some places, it was unpleasant, so to speak. The feeling of inferiority built up. Thus, when you have the opportunity to be the ruler, it's very difficult to give it up. So more and more Sephardi Jews, Sephardi leaders, even before the war, but of course after the war, they decided to go with the Zionist movement. Still, some of them said, but we know the Arabs. We are in good relations with the Arabs. It's not only that we know them and we know the one. No, we're in good relation with them. And we think that we can bridge the gap between Zionism and the Arabs, to tell them what Zionism all the time told themselves, that Zionism would be blessed for all the inhabitants of Palestine, and you don't have to worry from, the rise of Zionism will bring money from Europe and will bring here, the Jewish mind and so on and so forth, and the land would be, there would be prosperity for everyone. And this is what they told the Arabs of Palestine. And I think they believed in it. It's not that they wanted to cheat the Arabs of Palestine. They believed that it can be done. But for doing this, the Zionists, many of them came from Russia with their revolutionary past, that they can be tamed here and behave differently if they just listen to people like Eliashar or Malul or Shlush and other people who had experience with dealing with the Arabs. But of course, they didn't want to hear too much about living together peacefully.
So I have to ask, how much of this is about racialized attitudes? How much of this story is about basically Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews having to deal with a kind of racialized view that the Zionist movement has of them? And what do they do with that?
It is difficult to assess, but it is true, of course, that most Zionist activists, maybe most of the newcomers from Eastern Europe, they viewed the local Jews as inferior, as Arabs, and the Jews from here themselves, they saw themselves sometimes as Arabs. But an Arab became a kind of derogatory term, which was not so before. Beforehand, to be an Arab, Arabs are proud of being Arabs. For Europeans to be an Arab, it's an insult, not for Arabs. And in this sense, they started, some of them, who distinguish themselves from the Arabs. And we can see the difference between what people write in late Ottoman period and what they write during the Mandate about the Arabs, about Arab culture. They can, speak highly about Arab culture at the beginning, and then they can write about Arabs as thieves, ignorant, and so on and so forth.
The title of the book in English says Mizrahi Jews, Palestinian Arabs, and Ashkenazi Jews. But in the original Hebrew, the Ashkenazim are in parentheses. So saying it's predominantly about Mizrahi Jews and Palestinian Arabs. And that led me to think or to inquire whether it's actually the other way around, that it's the crux of the issue here is Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. And as you write in the book, identity is something that is always developed in opposition to another person's identity, in opposition to something else. And to me, I want to ask, to what extent do you think that really the real protagonists here are the Ashkenazim, in opposition to whom the Mizrahis developed their own identity?
Well, I wanted to write a book about Mizrahi Jews and Arabs, Palestinians. And when I started to write it, I realized that it cannot be written without the Ashkenazim. Because without, when we write history, what is history? History is about change. And the change was the coming of Ashkenazim and the dominance of Ashkenazim in this country. And this is change. And when you study change, you cannot, of course, but to focus also about the cause of the change. And also, when for many years the Ashkenazim were the hegemony here, and they, in a sense, decided the fate of both the Mizrahim and the Arabs. But because I didn't want to write about them, I put them in parentheses. But the parenthesis is very, very strong in the sense that, well, look at here. This is a story.
They cannot be ignored. Yeah.
No, more than it. This is a story.
Yeah.
The story is in the parentheses.
Right. Oh, I see what you mean.
So one of the things that I really loved about this book is that you write, and there's constantly a very subtle sense of a world that could have been, of a different path, of a road not taken. And in that subtlety, it kind of defies kind of inevitable accounts, these accounts of deterministic accounts of history in which, something began 100 years ago and then then comes to fruition or culminates now. But there's one exception. And in one of the last chapters of the book, the title is From Political Changeover to Political Assassination. And there is this strong sense of inevitability and something that is so powerful that it really does kind of shape the trajectory of afterwards. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about that statement, about the role of Rabin's assassination in these relations between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews, and Mizrahi Jews and Palestinians. And can you tell us more about that chapter?
First, I think we have to think about determinism in history. And as historians, we have the end game. We are, of course, this is not the end, but I wrote the book in 2021 during the riots in Ramle and in Lod and in Jaffa and the missiles on Jerusalem and bombardments of Gaza and hundreds of people killed in Gaza and, 2 Jews in Israel and a couple of Arabs in Israel. So this is the environment, the situation in which I sit and write. So this is I think I cannot understand the book without this situation. Had I written a book during Oslo years, in October 94, the book would have been different, I guess. Also, the way I look at history would have been different. So determinism is not only in the sense that, this necessarily led to that, but because I'm a historian, I cannot tell anything about what will happen tomorrow. But I took upon myself to explain what led to the situation that we are now. So we take this path and we say, this led to this, and this led to that, and this led to that. And here we find, at the beginning, we can find Cain and Abel, maybe. So this is what I find at the beginning. Or the destruction of the first temple. So we go back to understand what is happening now, right? Now, the assassination of Rabin, the fact that the Yigal Amir was of a Yemenite origin, Aka Mizrahi, is not very important in one sense, because the public discourse was not about his Mizrahiness. It was about his being part of the religious, national, radical circles. But at the same time, we all knew it, that he was Mizrahi. And when we look also at the religious national movement, which was predominantly Ashkenazi for many years, we can also understand that the cadres, or among their cadres, there are many Mizrahim. And the people who go out to the streets and then go to prison, they might be Mizrahi as well. I mean, there is much higher chance that they would be Mizrahim. So it's not about determinism, though I have no answer about the bigger question of the determinism, whether everything written from the beginning.
But there's, I think, a more fundamental question here about the value of political power. Because over the years, the Mizrahim have accumulated more and more political power. And I think right now we're probably at the peak of that. But, when Yael was talking about political changeover, Menachem Begin's arrival in power, well, he was, of course, famously Polish, but still stood for the many Mizrahim. And it was really the renaissance of Mizrahi politics in Israel. Yet some of the, looking at it, as you say, as a historian, the very... a long view, right, of the trends over history, the great political power that they gained did, well, not little, but not enough to change the course of history, the way the Mizrahim were going. How do you explain that?
I don't have a good explanation for that. I would say that the definition of Mizrahim, and this is part of the book, I mean, that in the last government, I mean, in what was called the center-left government, there were also Mizrahi ministers. But for the Mizrahim of the Likud, they were not Mizrahi enough, even if, I don't know, Meir Cohen lived in Dimona all of his life and so on and so forth, because of definition of Mizrahi the political definition became part of the definition of Mizrahi. So you have to be right-wing in order to be considered Mizrahi. So if you have a Mizrahi name and you support Meretz, God forbid, people can tell you are not Mizrahi anymore. It's like when Charlie Beaton, the head of the Black Panthers, the Israeli Black Panthers from Jerusalem, of Moroccan origin, when he went to meet with Arafat in 84, more or less. So he was attacked because how come by Moroccans? How come that you go to visit Arafat? We are Moroccans. This is against the rules of our community. So what happens, and this is a process since 1977, what happened is that the definition of good Mizrahi is to be right-wing and to be anti-Arab. And in this very period, there were members of the Likud, ministers in the Israeli cabinet, like Meir Shitrit, like David Levy, like Katzav, who said, no, we are much less radical and much less anti-Arab than the Ashkenazi ones. Look at Rabbi Levinger of Gush Emunim. Look at Rabbi Meir Kahane. No, we are not radicals. We are in better contact with Arabs. You remember the mayor of Ashkelon. He was a Moroccan religious person, very nice. He went from synagogue to synagogue to explain, the Oslo Agreement and the need to peace, and even during the Madrid years, and even before, during the First Intifada. And this was the year that, for the first time, people would tell a public figure, a Moroccan public figure, no, If you do that, you are not Moroccan anymore. Very interesting.
And this is also why someone like Netanyahu, who's an Ashkenazi elitist millionaire, is considered, sort of like a pro-Mizrahi or, a representative of the community, even though his biography is the complete opposite of that.
Yes, and sometimes people explain it in that the left has nothing to do with, with the Jewish tradition, they forgot to be Jews and so on and so forth. But also when we speak about people who didn't forget to be Jews, I mean, they go every Shabbat, maybe every day to synagogue. They wear tefillin every day. In the minute that they say something which is peace is one of the names of God, we have to make peace with the Palestinians, you are not considered one of the community. This is a tragedy of recent years. It happened also to Ashkenazim, among Ashkenazim. I mean, the crisis of what was called the peace camp is not only, among Mizrahim, the peace camp.
But going back to what we said earlier about definitions and the different communities, maybe what accounts for this is that over the generations, the Mizrahim were separated from their Arabness or maybe their Arab heritage, and the Mizrahiness is only measured in opposition to the Ashkenazi left, as it were.
That is very true. That is very true. I mean, when we spoke about, or when Mizrahi or Sephardi Jews spoke about their Mizrahiness, let's say in the 60s and 70s, these were the very people who came from Iraq and Morocco or Afghanistan or wherever, and they spoke about their experiences with Muslims, sometimes negative, sometimes positive, but it was not the enemy for them. The second generation, they don't know Arabic, they don't know Persian, they are not part of the Middle East in any sense, except for music, of course. But politically, what keeps them to be Mizrahim is, that's the other definition, I mean, the other, group is the Ashkenazi group, and they don't want, or they too much want, to be Ashkenazim, so they're against Ashkenazim. And against Ashkenazim, and this goes back to 77. Why a group like Peace Now was involved only in 77? Why there was no peace movement in Israel before the rise of the Likud to power? Because Peace Now was an Ashkenazi group who resisted the change in the politics because they were, detached from power. And they wanted to be part of decision-making. And this is what they did as a movement. So in this way, they actually put the struggle for peace in a very clear social circle, which is Ashkenazim who lost the elections.
So interestingly, the establishment of Peace Now is a Mizrahi story. The most Ashkenazi group you can think of is essentially a Mizrahi story.
In what sense?
In what sense? That it was done in opposition to the rise of Mizrahi politics.
I in the book I mentioned that there were three, mass movements in Israel in the 70s. And usually we remember Gush Emunim and Peace Now. And Gush Emunim and Peace Now were both, Ashkenazi movements. But the larger movement was the Tshuva movement. The Harav Reuven Elbaz in Jerusalem and the Harav Ovadia and his pupils and so on. And this was the real movement who came not to fight about the hills of Judea and Samaria or the West Bank and about occupation. No, about the well-being of the youth in the neighborhoods of Jerusalem, of Tel Aviv, of Ashdod, and other places. So this was very, very strong. And in this sense, what we see now is Gush Emunim, together with the Tshuva movement, together established a coalition.
What do you think about this idea about the mobility of Mizrahim? That there really has been social and economic change and cultural change that has allowed the Mizrahim to actually have a lot more standing in society.
Creation of a Mizrahi middle class, for example.
For example. And where does that fit in? So where does the economic story fit into your story? And it's kind of I know that it's not what you were focusing on, but because your definition of identity is kind of this moving target that changes and shifts, where does the social and economic enter into that?
It is very important part of it. And the important part of it is that when we look at incidents of lynchings or mass demonstration and so on, we can see a lot of Mizrahim, of course, but mostly from the middle lower class. If you check the people who participated in the lynch in Bat Yam, 12 people were arrested
Last year.
And brought to trial. All 12 are Mizrahim. But all of them are of the lower class. You wouldn't find, PhD student in chemistry from Ben Gurion University arrested for throwing stones on Arabs. So it has a lot to do with class. Now, also when you analyze patterns of voting, the Mizrahi middle class is less committed to the idea that Mizrahi should vote for the Likud. Many of them voted for the Labor or for Lapid and so on. So without dealing with class issues, we cannot really understand the story here. But when we go back to the 50s and 60s, and we understand that the Mizrahi were channeled into the lower class, we understand their, the presence in prisons on many, criminal issues, and also in illegal violence against Arabs. By the way, this is true for the state of Israel within the Green Line, because when we look on violence outside the Green Line against Palestinians, there is equality between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim. Because outside the Green Line, this is this different state project, which is to enlarge the Jewish Israeli dominancy over larger and larger areas. So it's half legitimate, even if sometimes people are brought to trial. Inside Israel, of course,
Oh, I thought you were going to say that because it's a state project, it's more Ashkenazi than, just a street in Tel Aviv.
No, it was more Ashkenazi for many years, but in the last 10, 15 years, Mizrahi Jews from all over the country, they come to the outposts and they live there, and they go out to beat shepherds and so on. So they are part of the project. This is a way to enter the project.
Yeah, so maybe that leads into my next question, which might be our final one, we'll see, about where all this is going. I mean, there's been a great shift to the right in Israeli society across the board, and most notably among the Mizrahim who have been voting en masse for Likud and for other right-wing parties, and even at the forefront of this shift to the right stands the poster boy Itamar Ben-Gvir, who himself is a Mizrahi hooligan who rose to great power.
Hooligan and a lawyer.
And a lawyer, exactly. So he's educated. Is he middle class or not? That's also a good question.
It's an important question. I think he's middle class who didn't give up his lower class identity, and this is what gives him power among the lower class.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And also, going back to this very complex issues, Yael was asking earlier about how you presented always what could have been, but I'd like to add to Yael's point that you never do it in a romanticized way. I mean, it's always there in the background, but you're not, unlike other people who have explored this issue of, a certain idyllic existence of Jews and Arabs in Palestine. You never fall into that.
I want to say something about
please.
that. And this is because I think that blood is the most important factor in any conflict, and in our conflict. So when we look at what happened, I mentioned 1929, when most of the people were killed. In Sfat, all of them were Mizrahim. In Jerusalem, most of them were Mizrahim. In Hebron, most of them were of the Sephardi community. So you understand that even if Palestinians or Arabs in general, they also sometimes speak or fantasize about Mizrahi Palestinian alliance against Zionism, you cannot kill them and suggest or offer an alliance at the same time. And this is also what happened in the 70s. in the 70s, the day just after the big days of high days of the Black Panthers, and then the Yom Kippur War, there was, before the war and after the war, the Katyushas, the rockets over, Bet She'an and Kiryat Shmona, which is predominantly Mizrahi, and then the huge attacks by cells of the Democratic Front and Popular Front to Bet She'an, to Kiryat Shmona, to Ma'alot, also to Nahariya. But if you see, most of the people who were killed were Mizrahim from the lower class. So the idea of alliance is a very nice idea, but it has nothing to do with reality, and people are more clever than that.
Yeah. But always there's like this tension between what could have been and what and the reality. And I want to ask you. You said earlier that as a historian you can't say what's going to be tomorrow morning, but do you see any way out of this mess? We are going in what seems like a very unidirectional slope. Is there any chance of some sort of like regeneration, renaissance of Mizrahi politics that is anything but what it seems now?
I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't see anything. But Yael is here, and she has...
She's the optimistic one.
She's the optimistic one.
I do think that in your history, and this is a very important thing to say about, because this is possibly the first book that tells this story. There is no other book that tells this story. And in that sense, I think that if you don't know what is part of your history and that there were other possibilities, then how could you follow those possibilities if they never existed? And so in a sense, while you say that you don't see a path forward, what you actually do is create the possibility to even think those paths. So there's a paradox here too.
To this I agree, because what I try to do in the book is to show also Mizrahim that would read it, look, it is not necessarily like that. You have to remember many of your fathers and grandfathers, they felt good with the Arabs. They didn't want to control the Arabs. They wanted to live in peace with the Arabs. They didn't feel that they are better than the Arabs because they are Jews and so on and so forth. Just remember, if you are traditional, this is part of your tradition. If you are not traditional, this is part of your history. But this is what happened. This is what was. You cannot, paint all the history of Jews in Muslim countries in one color, because it was not. And this is indeed very important to remember, because it means that your definition or your identity as Mizrahi doesn't mean really that you have to be anti-Palestinian or anti-peace or anti-peace movement. The problem of the peace movement is a different problem that we should deal in.
No, and there are some, self-proclaimed Mizrahi movements and people who speak in those terms. The problem is that they're a very tiny minority among the Mizrahi community.
Yeah.
All right, Professor Hillel Cohen, author of The New Enemies, A Love Story, Mizrahi Jews, Palestinian Arabs and Ashkenazi Jews from the Rise of Zionism to the Present. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you for this lovely conversation.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 800 interviews to keep you entertained and hopefully annoyed. You can like us on Facebook, follow me and Yael and the podcast on Twitter, and join us next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.